The pot roast sat between us like a cooling corpse. My mother wiped her mouth, her voice devoid of heat. My parents said, "Your sister's family always comes first. You are always last." Elena smirked over her wine. Her expensive diamonds, bought with money I didn't know was mine. Catching the dim overhead light. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the silver fork in my hand. "Good to know," I answered. The air in the room didn't break, it solidified. My father simply nodded as if she had just recited the weather. I walked out into the Denver night with a strange, humming clarity. Within an hour, I was sitting in my car with my laptop glowing against the steering wheel. I began to separate money and plans. I unlinked the savings account I had shared with my mother since college. I revoked the emergency access to my credit line that Elena used for her mini crisis. I watched the digital numbers migrate into a new, private vault. My thumb hovered over the final confirm button. 3 weeks later, the silence was shattered by a series of frantic notifications. Then a family emergency hit them. Elena's husband had gambled away the mortgage on a bad crypto tip, and the bank was moving fast. My mother's name appeared on my screen, vibrating against the bedside table in my apartment. I let it dance until it went dark. They expected me to pay. Assuming my silence was just my usual stoicism. They didn't realize the bridge was already gone. I flew back not as a daughter, but as a creditor. The family home felt smaller, smelling of stale tea and desperation. They sat in the living room, surrounded by past due notices that looked like jagged teeth. My father cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze while Elena sobbed into a silk handkerchief. They had a seat saved for me at the head of the table. It was not an honor, it was an ambush. They waited for me to open my checkbook. I didn't reach for my purse. Instead, I pulled a thick manila folder from my briefcase and slid it across the wood. The sound was like a guillotine blade hitting the block. "What is this?" my mother whispered, her eyes darting to the legal seal on the first page. But what happened next left them frozen. It was a formal loan agreement with a lien on their property and a mandatory audit of Elena's spending. No one spoke for a full minute. My father's face turned a bruised shade of purple as he read the interest rates. These weren't family terms. These were the cold, hard numbers of a stranger who knew their worth. Elena reached for the pen, her hand shaking with a mixture of rage and necessity. I stood up, smoothing my coat without offering a single word of comfort. They had spent years teaching me my place at the back of the line. Now, I was the only one holding the rope. The silence in the room tasted like copper. My father finally looked up from the contract, his eyes narrowing into slits of disbelief. "You want us to sign a lion against our home for your own sister." His voice cracked at the edges. I didn't blink. I leaned back against the mahogany chair and watched the clock on the wall. The ticking was the only honest sound left between us. I wasn't their daughter today. I was a debt collector. Elena reached out to touch the paper, her fingers trembling against the heavy bond. "Ivy, please. We are family. This is just a mistake." She looked at my mother for support, but Margaret was staring at the floor. The shame was finally starting to outweigh the entitlement. I tapped my pen against the table with a rhythmic, hollow sound. "Family has a price now?" I said softly. "You set the rate at dinner. I am just finalizing the terms." The pressure in the room shifted when my father stood up. He paced the length of the rug, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He stopped at the window and looked out at the street where I used to play. "We don't have 24 hours, he muttered. "The bank is calling at 9 in the morning." This was the escalation I expected. They had waited until the very last second to ask me. They thought desperation would make me soft and compliant. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set it on the table. The screen stayed dark and silent. "Then you should probably start reading faster," I replied. My mother finally looked up, her face a mask of sudden, cold fury. She didn't look like the woman who baked birthday cakes anymore. She looked like a predator who had lost its claws. "You would really let us lose everything over a grudge," she hissed. It wasn't a grudge. It was math. A new detail emerged as Elena finally broke. She confessed that the debt wasn't just the mortgage. She had taken out private loans in our parents' names using forged signatures. The room went deathly quiet. My father froze by the window, his back still turned to us. This was the mid-scene turn that changed everything. The stakes weren't just financial anymore, they were criminal. Elena's smirk had been a mask for a much deeper, darker kind of rot. My father turned around slowly, his face drained of color. He looked at Elena, as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. The power balance had flipped. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the only thing standing between his favorite daughter and a jail cell. He walked back to the table and picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake this time. He was defeated. He signed his name at the bottom of the first page. One by one, they added their signatures to the document. The air seemed to leave the room with every stroke of the pen. It was a funeral for the family we used to pretend to be. I gathered the papers and slid them back into my folder. "I will wire the first installment tonight," I said. I stood up to leave, but my mother caught my sleeve. "Are you happy now?" she whispered. I looked at her and felt nothing. I walked out of the house into the biting Denver cold. The folder was heavy against my side. I had the signatures, but the victory tasted like ash and iron. My objective was simple: get to my hotel and initiate the wire transfer. I needed to lock them into the deal before they found a way to retract. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "Don't pay her debt, Ivy." I stopped under a flickering street lamp. My breath drifted in white plumes toward the dark sky. The pressure mounted as I realized someone else knew about Elena's forgery. I climbed into my rental car and locked the doors. The click of the mechanism felt final. My hands were steady, but my heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the phone. The text was followed by a photo of a second, even larger loan document I missed. The mid-scene turn arrived when I zoomed in on the image. It wasn't just Elena's signature on this secret debt. My mother's handwriting was right there next to it, clear and unmistakable. Margaret wasn't a victim of Elena's greed. She was an active partner in the deception. They hadn't just used me to save the house. They were using my money to cover a much larger crime. The power dynamic shifted again. I was being played. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city lights. My mind raced through the legal implications of the new discovery. If I wired the money now, I was essentially funding a cover-up for fraud. I pulled into a gas station to think. The fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and pale. I called the unknown number back. It went straight to a generic voicemail. My family was a nest of secrets, each one deeper than the last. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat and began digging. I needed to know who sent that message. The digital trail led back to a small law firm in the suburbs. Elena hadn't just forged signatures, she had burned professional bridges as well. The lawyer was likely a disgruntled creditor looking for a way out. This was a war of attrition. Every time I thought I found the bottom, the floor dropped out again. The complication grew when I checked my personal bank alerts. A small, unauthorized withdrawal had already been made from my primary account. It was a test. They were still using the old backup codes. I thought I had changed. My mother's soft touch was all over it. She wasn't waiting for the wire. She was reaching in to take what she felt she was owed. I felt a cold, sharp anger replaced the lingering guilt. I reached for the folder and pulled out the signed contract. I didn't tear it up. Instead, I took a photo of the signature page and sent it to the unknown number. I added a single line of text. I have the leverage now. I put the car in drive and headed back toward my parents' house. I wasn't going to the hotel. I was going back to finish this. The hunter had become the prey. The tires crunched over the frozen gravel as I pulled back into the driveway. My objective was simple: force a full confession before the sun rose. I gripped the manila folder until the edges dug into my palms. The house was dark, except for a single lamp glowing in the kitchen window. I let the engine idle for a moment. The pressure was a physical weight against my chest. They weren't just desperate. They were dangerous partners in a lie. I let myself in through the side door. The kitchen smelled of burnt coffee and something metallic. My mother was sitting at the table, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. She didn't look surprised to see me. "The withdrawal was a mistake, Ivy," she said before I could speak. Her voice was too steady. It was the sound of a woman who had rehearsed her defense. I realized then that she had been monitoring my accounts for months. I dropped the new loan document on the table. The image of her signature glowed under the harsh kitchen light. Margaret's face didn't crumble. Instead, her eyes hardened into something unrecognizable. "We did what we had to do to keep this family afloat," she whispered. The power balance shifted instantly. She wasn't pleading anymore. She was justifying. She viewed my success as a collective resource, a debt I owed them for simply existing. It was chilling. "Where is Elena?" I asked, my voice cutting through her excuses. Margaret gestured toward the darkened living room. My sister was curled on the sofa, a shadow among shadows. She had heard everything. The primary obstacle wasn't the money anymore. It was the web of complicity they had woven together. They were a unified front of deceit. I felt like an intruder in my own childhood home. I took a step back, hitting the counter with a dull thud. The mid-scene turn came from the hallway. My father appeared, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Margaret with a hollow, terrifying clarity. "You told me the bank approved the extension," he said quietly. He hadn't known about the second loan or the forged signatures. The partnership wasn't 3 against 1. It was 2 against 2. The betrayal had a second layer. My mother had lied to the man she shared a bed with. He walked over and picked up the paper, his hands trembling violently. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. He looked at the signature, then at his wife. "You used her," he said, his voice rising. "You used both of them." Margaret stood up, her chair screeching against the linoleum. The family was fracturing in real time. I watched the person I once respected most turn into a stranger. It was a brutal revelation. I reached for my phone to freeze every account I owned. But as the screen lit up, a new notification appeared from my bank. It wasn't a withdrawal this time. It was a massive incoming wire transfer from an offshore account. The amount was exactly what Elena owed, plus interest. Someone else had just paid the debt in my name. I looked at the 3 of them, but their confusion was genuine. A new player had entered the game. The blue light of my phone screen felt like a physical burn. I had one objective: trace the source of that mysterious offshore wire. I couldn't let my family think I was the one who had finally caved. The room remained thick with my father's quiet rage and my mother's brittle defiance. Elena sat up on the sofa, her face puffy and pale. She looked at the notification on my screen. "Is it over?" she whispered. I didn't answer her. I walked to the kitchen island and opened my laptop with trembling fingers. The obstacle was no longer just their greed. It was the sudden, unearned anonymity of this new money. If I couldn't prove where it came from, I was legally tied to a potential laundering scheme. My fingers flew across the keys as I accessed the bank's transaction details. The pressure built with every second of the loading bar. I needed a name, not just a string of numbers. The mid-scene turn arrived when the routing address appeared in the bottom corner of the statement. It wasn't a bank in the Caymans or a law firm in Zurich. The money had originated from a trust account based in Seattle. It was my own business partner's secondary firm. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't been as invisible as I thought. He had been watching my accounts for unusual activity. The power had shifted back to my professional world. I slammed the laptop shut and looked at the three people standing in the shadows of my past. My father was still staring at the forged signature, his world effectively destroyed. He didn't care about the new money. He only cared about the betrayal under his own roof. I felt a surge of cold pity for him. "The debt is paid," I said, my voice echoing in the small kitchen. "But not by me. And not for free." My mother stepped forward, her eyes searching mine for a weakness she could exploit. "Then we don't need your contract," she said, her voice regaining its sharp, manipulative edge. She thought the mystery money was a jail-free card. She didn't understand that every favor comes with a hook. I watched her reach for the manila folder on the table. I beat her to it, pinning the papers down with my palm. The tension was a living thing between us. "The contract stands," I told her, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Because that money is a loan to me, not a gift to you." I could see the gears turning in her head as she tried to find a new angle. Elena stood up and walked toward the door, her movements jerky and erratic. She looked like she was going to run. My father didn't move. He just watched his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my car keys. I had what I needed to finish this, but the cost was rising. As I turned toward the door, my phone chimed with a final message from my partner. It wasn't a confirmation of the wire. It was a warning that the bank had flagged the transaction for fraud investigation. The money that saved them was about to trigger a federal inquiry. I was now the center of a storm. The federal fraud alert blinked on my screen like a digital heartbeat. I had one objective: scrub my name from this incoming disaster before the bank froze my life. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of ozone and old grease. My mother watched the laptop as if it were a weapon. She didn't realize the trap was already closing on all of us. I needed to act before the morning sun hit the driveway. The clocks were ticking in every room. I grabbed the manila folder and shoved the contract toward my father. He was the only one with clean hands, even if they were shaking. The primary obstacle was my mother's sudden realization that the money was tainted. She reached for the laptop, her movements frantic and sharp. "If that money is flagged, we lose the house anyway," she shrieked. Her voice was a jagged blade. I blocked her hand with my forearm. The heat from her skin felt like a brand. The mid-scene turn happened when the house phone rang. It was the landline, a dusty relic we never used. I picked it up on the second ring. A voice I recognized from my Seattle office spoke, without an introduction. It wasn't my partner. It was his lead auditor, a man who dealt in facts and bloodless numbers. "Ivy, the transfer didn't come from the firm," he said. My heart skipped a beat. "It came from a dormant account in your name." I stared at the black receiver in my hand. The power balance shattered. I hadn't opened a dormant account in years. My mother's eyes darted away, fixed on the linoleum floor. She had stolen my identity long before this current crisis. She hadn't just forged signatures on loans. She had built a shadow version of my financial life to hide her own rot. I felt a cold, hollow vacuum open in my chest. The person I called mother was a ghost. My father took the phone from my hand. He listened to the auditor's voice for 3 seconds before hanging up. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked finished. He walked to the kitchen junk drawer and pulled out a heavy set of keys. "We are leaving," he said to my mother. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble. He wasn't asking. He was issuing a final decree. Elena began to cry, a high, thin sound that grated on my nerves. I stood my ground as they circled each other. I needed the signed contract to be my shield against the coming federal storm. I held the pen out to my mother. "Sign it, or I call the police myself," I said. It wasn't a bluff. She saw the truth in my eyes. She grabbed the pen and scrawled her name with a violence that ripped the paper. It was done. The legal chain was forged. I had my leverage back. The complication shifted from financial to physical. My mother tried to grab the folder, but my father intercepted her. He pinned the document to the table with a heavy hand. "Ivy, get out," he told me. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the woman he had loved for 40 years. I saw the light of his devotion go out. It was replaced by a hard, transactional stare. I grabbed the folder and backed toward the door. I hit the cold air of the porch and didn't stop running until I reached the car. I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing the peeling paint on the garage. My phone buzzed again. It was a second alert from the bank. The wire had been reversed. The money was gone. The debt was back, and now the fraud was documented. My mother's plan had collapsed in less than an hour. I sat in the dark, watching the house. I realized that being last in the family wasn't a burden. It was an escape hatch. I was the only one who could walk away from the wreckage. I opened the folder one last time to check the signatures. They were there. Jagged and ugly. They were my tickets to freedom. I put the car in reverse. I didn't look back at the window where my mother's shadow still moved. As I reached the end of the driveway, a police cruiser turned onto the street. Its lights weren't flashing, but it was moving slowly. Searching for a house number. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I didn't know if they were there for the fraud or for Elena's secret debts. I didn't stay to find out. I turned the opposite way and accelerated toward the highway. My phone lit up with a final, chilling text from Elena. "She's gone. Ivy." I slammed the brakes as the tires crunched on the asphalt behind me. My objective was absolute. Protect my freedom before the law grouped me with my mother's crimes. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The text from Elena burned on my dashboard screen. "She's gone, Ivy." I didn't know if that meant she fled or did something far worse. The cold air outside felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. I had to decide now. The primary obstacle loomed in my rearview mirror as the officer stepped out. The blue and red strobes began to dance across the snow, dusted lawn. I realized I couldn't just drive away. My name was already on the reversed wire transfer. If I fled, I looked guilty of the very fraud my mother initiated. The pressure moved from my chest to my throat. I watched the officer approach the front door of the house. He didn't even look toward my idling car. I turned off the engine and stepped into the freezing night. The silence was eerie, broken only by the hum of the police radio. I walked toward the house, my boots sinking into the crusty mud. The front door was wide open, revealing the empty hallway. My father was gone. Elena was nowhere to be seen. The mid-scene turn hit me when I reached the kitchen. There was a single, bloody handprint from my father's split knuckles on the manila folder I had left on the kitchen counter. Near where my mother had scrawled her violent signature. The power balanced, shifted as I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. Someone had fought over those papers the moment I walked out. I followed the trail of disturbed furniture into the dining room. The officer was already there. His flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He wasn't looking for a fraudster. He was looking at a broken window. Shards of glass glittered like diamonds on the carpet. My father's heavy coat lay abandoned near the jagged frame. "Are you Ivy?" the officer asked, his hand resting on his utility belt. I nodded, my voice trapped in my dry throat. He didn't arrest me. Instead, he handed me a small, crumpled note he found on the sideboard. It was in my father's hurried, blocky script. "I'm fixing the ranking." It read. The realization chilled me to the bone. He hadn't just left. He had forced Margaret into the car to take her to the one person who could end the cycle. Their old family lawyer. The pressure escalated when my phone buzzed with a location share from Elena. She was at a precinct downtown, not at the house. She had gone to turn herself in before our father could do something irreversible. I looked at the officer and showed him the folder. "This is the evidence of the fraud," I said. My voice was steady now. I was finally handing over the burden I had carried since that dinner. I wasn't the last one anymore. We drove to the station in a blur of streetlights and sirens. The objective had changed to damage control. I needed to ensure Elena didn't drown herself to save our mother. When we arrived, the lobby smelled of floor wax and old coffee. I saw Elena through the glass of an interview room. She looked small and defeated. She wasn't smirking now. She was crying. She looked at me and mouthed a single word through the window. "Run." I didn't run. I sat on the hard plastic bench and waited for the detectives. The mid-scene turn arrived when a man in a sharp suit walked into the lobby. He wasn't a cop. He was the auditor from my Seattle office. He had flown in on a private charter the moment the fraud alert hit. "Ivy, we found the rest of it," he said. He dropped a second folder on the seat beside me. It contained proof of a massive inheritance. The power shifted as I read the documents. My grandmother had left a trust for me, not Elena. My mother had been siphoning it for decades to fund my sister's life. The ranking wasn't just emotional. It was a financial heist. I wasn't the strong one because I was capable. I was the strong one because they were stealing my strength. The betrayal was total and absolute. I looked at the auditor. "Can we freeze it all?" I asked him. He nodded once. "It's already done." The complication arose as the back doors opened, and my father walked in. He was covered in soot, and his knuckles were raw from the struggle at the house. He didn't have my mother with him. He walked straight to the desk and put her wedding ring on the counter. "She's at the airport," he told the sergeant. And I told them everything about the accounts. He looked at me, then looked away. He had finally chosen me. The precinct lobby was a vacuum of fluorescent light and cold tile. My objective was to reclaim my identity before the legal machine crushed what remained of us. My father sat on the bench, his hands raw and empty. The primary obstacle arrived in a burst of static from the sergeant's radio. My mother had been detained at the gate, but she wasn't alone. She had stolen my original birth certificate and my passport from my safe. She was trying to flee the country as me. I felt the last thread of daughterly instinct snap. The mid-scene turn came when the auditor handed me a final ledger. The trust fund hadn't just been drained. It had been used as collateral for a series of offshore investments. My mother hadn't just stolen my past. She had gambled away my future in a game I never agreed to play. I looked at the signatures on the ledger. They were perfect copies of my own handwriting. She had practiced being me for years. The detective emerged from the back, his face a mask of professional boredom. "She's claiming you authorized everything. Ivy." He dropped a recorded phone call onto the desk. The voice on the tape sounded exactly like mine, cold and certain. The power balance shifted as I realized the depth of the mimicry. She hadn't just taken the money. She had created a digital ghost of me to take the fall. I was fighting a version of myself she had built. I didn't scream or cry. I pulled my phone out and played a video from the night of the ranking dinner. I had recorded the moment she said I was last. In the background, the kitchen clock was visible, proving I was in Denver while the ghost made calls from Seattle. The detective's eyebrows rose. It was the one piece of evidence her vanity hadn't predicted. She had documented her own motive. The ranking was her confession. The silence followed. The truth finally settled in the room like dust after a collapse. My father reached out to touch my shoulder, but I stepped away. He had chosen me too late to save the girl I used to be. The auditor began the process of freezing the offshore assets, clawing back the remnants of my stolen inheritance. Elena watched from her glass room, a spectator to the family's final execution. We were no longer a line. We were individuals in a wreckage. I walked out of the station as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. The air was sharp, smelling of pine and exhaust. My mother was being driven in through the back gates, her face pressed against the window. We locked eyes for a second. There was no remorse in her gaze, only the fury of a caught thief. I turned toward my car and didn't look back. I wasn't last anymore. I was the only one left standing.